January 1942, somewhere on the frozen plains outside Ozev, the night sky was a sheet of black glass, cracking under the weight of a cold so violent that even breath turned to ice before reaching the air. Snowflakes drifted sideways, not falling but being hurled by the wind like tiny shards of broken steel. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and the battlefield had gone silent, not because the fighting had stopped, but because the machines that carried the fight simply quit breathing. Row after row of T-34 tanks stood buried beneath snowdrifts, their armor plates white with frost, engines dead as stone. Crews slammed hammers against frozen hatches, shouting at engines that could no longer hear them. Fuel lines burst like brittle bones. Oil inside the motors thickened into a solid black gel. Steel contracted so sharply that bolts snapped clean off, leaving turrets half-locked. Guns aimed nowhere. And in the middle of this frozen graveyard stood Nikolai Morozov, 22 years old, hands raw and bleeding from wrenchwork that no longer mattered. Hours earlier he had been fighting to keep just one engine alive, but now he watched dozens die at once, as if winter itself was sweeping across the fields with a scythe, cutting down anything made by men, even the German panzers across the river Sleek, engineered for precision, were falling silent, their engines coughing once, twice, then freezing mid-rotation. No one fired. No one advanced. No one retreated. On that night, war paused, not by surrender, not by ceasefire, but by nature. War didn't stop these tanks. Winter did. The first snowstorm wasn't seen as a threat, just another obstacle to push through. By October 1941, German commanders believed the Red Army was already broken. "Moscow will fall before Christmas," officers boasted, their armored spearheads rolling deeper into Soviet territory with terrifying speed. Roads turned to mud, villages burned behind them, and panzer crews slept beside still-warm engines to fend off frost. But Christmas never came. Winter did. When temperatures plummeted far below what German planners had ever considered. Steel transformed from a weapon into a liability. Fuel thickened like coal tar. Engines seized before they even turned over. Batteries died overnight, their acid crystallizing. Gun breeches jammed, metal cracking with a sickening ping that echoed like shrapnel in the silence. Mechanics tried lighting fires beneath engines to warm them, but flames only warped casings and melted wiring. Inside their tanks, German crews shivered in summer uniforms, wrapping themselves in rags and stolen blankets. Frostbite eating fingers before bullets did. Soldiers who once feared Soviet artillery now feared touching bare metal because doing so could rip the skin straight off their hands. Commanders who once led blitzkrieg now watched their armored divisions sit useless, stranded along frozen valleys like monuments to overconfidence. But the Soviet side was suffering just as badly, only differently. Factories east of the Urals were producing tanks faster than the crews could be trained to use them. Trainloads of fresh T-34s arrived daily, their sloped armor and wide tracks perfect for snow if they could move. Instead, new tanks rolled off flatbeds only to freeze solid on the front lines. Engines refused to ignite. Gearboxes snapped like glass. Fuel deliveries stalled thanks to snow-choked supply routes, leaving tanks half full and good. For just one desperate charge before going quiet forever, entire battalions became steel sculptures buried beneath ice. Morale fractured on both sides. German soldiers cursed their engineers for designing machines too delicate for nature. Soviet crews blamed bureaucrats for sending tanks with no winterization. Commanding officers insisting courage will keep engines warm. Some men began to believe the war wasn't Germany versus the USSR anymore. It was mankind versus the elements. The front lines shifted from sweeping offensives to static, frostbitten stalemates. Tanks no longer clashed head-to-head. They sat like abandoned carcasses while infantry fought over which side could stand the cold longest. The landscape itself turned hostile. Frozen rivers became roads, then shattered beneath vehicle weight. Blizzards erased entire platoons overnight. Bodies of soldiers and horses froze where they fell, preserved like statues. Through it all, men kept dying, not from bullets, but from exposure. Some tanks were destroyed without a single shell fired. Ice crept into cylinders, expanding until metal fissured. Turrets rusted solid in a single storm. Crews gathered around fires, watching their steel beasts fade beneath snow, powerless to save them, for the first time since the war began. The battlefield obeyed no general, it obeyed the wind, and as both armies waited for spring to decide their fate, one truth became painfully clear: whoever learned to make their machines survive winter would win. But among the freezing hulks across the Soviet front, one young mechanic refused to let the cold choose the victor. His name was Nikolai Morozov, and while others waited for the thaw, he was already looking for fire. The cold had already claimed the pride of generals and the strength of armies. But Nikolai Morozov wasn't thinking about strategy or ideology that winter. He was thinking about engines, because engines were the only language he truly understood before the war. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even trained for battle. Nikolai grew up in a remote Siberian settlement where winters lasted longer than dreams. His father repaired tractors for collective farms. His uncles welded broken plows out of scrap. Every machine that survived the frost did so because someone forced it to. Nikolai learned early that factory manuals were written for perfect conditions Siberia never offered. At 17, he was already the village's unofficial mechanic. At 20, he enrolled at a regional technical school to study agricultural engineering, specializing in fuel distribution systems. And at 22, he found himself drafted into the Red Army and assigned not for combat skill, but for one line on his intake sheet: mechanical aptitude high. In the trenches, that meant he spent more time, elbow deep in frozen oil, than holding a rifle. He didn't resent it, he hated everything else about the front. But machines made sense. War did not. He watched officers bark impossible orders at tank crews, demanding they move vehicles that had solidified into blocks of ice. He listened to commanders blame soldiers for cowardice when engines failed to start. He saw mechanics punished for sabotage when metal cracked in temperatures no blueprint had warned about. Nikolai didn't fear the Germans nearly as much as he feared leadership's arrogance. One night, while the wind clawed at the trench walls, he sat beside a silent T-34 with 6 other mechanics. Frost stung their eyelashes, kerosene lamps flickered weakly, and tools stuck to bare skin like glue. "We need more fuel," one whispered. "We need new parts," another said. Nikolai shook his head. "We don't need fuel. We need heat." They stared, confused. Heat was something no one had any more, not for engines. And barely for themselves. He ripped open a fuel line, hands trembling, teeth chattering as he examined the thick, unmoving sludge that should have been oil. "Engines aren't dying because we ran out of power," he muttered. "They're dying because the cold is choking them before they can even breathe." The others dismissed him. They patched the line, moved to another tank, followed orders. Nikolai stayed behind, crouched beside the dead engine like a priest beside a corpse. He remembered a truck his father kept alive back home, a rusting relic from the 1930s that should have been scrap metal. In winter, they didn't warm it with a campfire like city mechanics did. That was suicide fires, warped metal, melted cables, sometimes ignited fuel. Instead, his father fed a slow flame into a metal coil filled with kerosene, running the coil beneath the oil lines. It warmed the fuel from inside, just enough to flow. "Machines don't need warmth," his father once told him. "They need the will to move. Give them that, and they'll survive anything." Now, huddled beside the silent T-34, those words hit him harder than the wind. Maybe the problem wasn't the cold itself. Maybe the problem was that no one had tried fighting it. Over the next week, Nikolai became a ghost of the trenches. While others slept, he tested spare tubing, hammering bent copper into makeshift channels. He siphoned kerosene into flasks, attached them to oil filters, watched how heat dispersed through metal when small flames, not open fires, were directed through controlled chambers. He failed dozens of times. Frost cracked pipes. Pressure ruptured seals. Once, a burst of flame nearly engulfed him when a wrong angle fed oxygen into a fuel pocket. But each failure taught him something new: traction. Resistance, flow. He started sketching designs on scraps of ration paper. Hand shaking not from fear but excitement. A heating system inside the engine, not beneath it. One that used the engine's own exhaust and controlled fuel burn to keep oil viscous even in the coldest conditions. He imagined rows of tanks, waking up before dawn. Engines rumbling while German shells froze beside them. He barely slept. He barely spoke. He barely noticed how his comrades stared, whispering that he'd finally cracked under the strain. Maybe he had. But not in the way they thought. One morning, while the horizon glowed faintly blue through the storm, Nikolai stood alone beside a disabled T-34 hull, hands blackened with grease, eyes burning with a mix of exhaustion and certainty. "This war won't be won by bullets," he whispered to himself. "Not here. Not now." He tightened the final clamp on his improvised heater system and stepped back. "If winter wants to kill our tanks," he muttered, "then I'll teach our tanks how to fight back." He struck a match. The flame ignited. The engine coughed. Once, twice. Then, in a frozen world where machines had forgotten how to breathe, the tank exhaled a deep, rumbling growl, alive again, and that was the moment. Nikolai realized something dangerous. He wasn't just fixing engines anymore. He was challenging winter itself, and winter would not give up without a fight. Snow fell like ash the next morning, soft and silent in eerie contrast to the chaos inside the Soviet command tent. Maps lay pinned beneath icicles of spilled tea. Officers huddled around oil lamps, arguing not about strategy but logistics. Tanks that couldn't move meant offensives that couldn't start. And while they shouted about supply routes and fuel reserves, Nikolai Morozov stood silently at the edge of the room, clutching a grease-stained schematic in shaking hands. When finally called to speak, he stepped forward like a man presenting a confession rather than a proposal. "The engines aren't failing mechanically," he began. "They're freezing. We need to heat them from the inside continuously." General Sokolov lifted an eyebrow. "We've tried external fires." "They damage armor?" "No." Morozov shook his head. "Not external heat. Internal, we mix kerosene with the engine oil just enough to thin it. Then we circulate it through a manifold heated by redirected exhaust gases. The engine warms itself as it runs." A hush fell, then laughter. One engineer scoffed loudly. "You want to burn the fuel inside the oil system? Are you insane? That's a rolling bomb." Another sneered. "You're a tractor mechanic, not a military engineer. Soviet tanks aren't farm trucks." A colonel leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Do you know what happens when you heat lubricants past ignition thresholds? Flames inside the engine block." Nikolai swallowed hard. "Not flames. Controlled heat. The exhaust is already hot, we're wasting it. We convert it into a thermal loop. Without this, engines will keep dying. We need circulation before ignition, not after." His logic bounced off cold faces. "What you're suggesting," the senior engineer said, voice dripping with disdain, "is suicidal. You would destroy the engines faster than the cold ever could." Permission denied. Orders: leave the tanks alone. Follow standard protocol. But protocol didn't resurrect steel. That night, while the officers slept under wool blankets, Nikolai trudged through knee-high snow toward the edge of the encampment. Moonlight barely revealed the silhouette of a wrecked T-34. Hull abandoned after shrapnel had torn through its tracks days earlier. It was considered scrap metal now, a donor for spare parts. To others, useless. To Nikolai, perfect. He set down his tools, breath fogging the air. His fingers, numb and raw, worked by memory rather than sight. He pulled open access hatches, loosened frozen bolts with a hammer, ran scavenged tubing along the manifold, and connected siphon lines from kerosene canisters stolen from the fuel depot. Every clang of metal echoed like artillery. Every flick of his lighter felt like treason. Wind cut through his coat, turning his joints to stone. But he heard his father's voice again, the one that survived every winter back home. "Machines die when men give up first." He refused to give up. Hours passed. The sky turned pale with pre-dawn frost. His creation was crude, ugly, even pipes welded at odd angles. Wraps of cloth sealing leaks, clamps hammered flat from scrap metal. But it didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to live. He opened the fuel valve. Kerosene seeped into thick oil like warm blood entering frozen veins. He redirected the exhaust with a twist of metal plating, forming a crude chamber around the manifold. The engine suddenly had a pulseway for heat to circulate before combustion. Nikolai paused, matchbook in hand, heart racing. If he was wrong, the tank wouldn't just fail, it might explode. His hands trembled. Not from fear but from the weight of possibility. He struck the match. A faint flame took hold in the heating chamber. Controlled, restrained. Heat seeped through the steel, vibrating along pipes. The engine gave a low, uncertain cough like a dying animal resisting its final breath. Nikolai held his own breath. Another cough. Rumble. The ground beneath him vibrated as the dead engine growled awake impossibly. Defiantly, its internals warming faster than the wind could steal heat away. The 34's cracked turret quivered as black smoke poured from its exhaust like resurrection steam. Nikolai stepped back, eyes wide, mouth open in stunned relief. It worked. It actually worked. He laughed, not joyfully, but with the exhausted disbelief of a man who'd spent weeks fighting a god and finally landed a blow. Then the laughter faded, replaced by a darker realization. No one else knew. No officer had approved it. No engineer had believed it. No unit was prepared to adopt it. If he told them now, they'd dismiss him again, or worse, discipline him for unauthorized tampering. The engine throbbed behind him. Alive in a frozen world of corpses, he placed a palm against the warm hull. "If you can breathe," he whispered, "others can too." But dawn was coming, and the moment the sun rose, he would have to decide, reveal his idea and face ridicule once more, or unleash it in secret, tank by tank, until the battlefield woke up roaring. Either way, winter had met its first challenger, and it had no idea a war had just begun. Snowstorms had a way of stripping away pride. By the time Colonel Vasily Markov summoned Nikolai to his command shelter, the man's uniform was stiff with frost, and the confidence that once fueled his orders had been replaced by quiet desperation. He unrolled a map, tapping his finger over a thin stretch of road leading toward a German supply depot. "We have the tanks," he muttered, voice low. "We just can't move them. If we wait until spring, they'll move on us first." Nikolai stood silently. Markov finally looked up. "I heard a rumor that you woke a dead engine in sub-zero conditions. At night, alone." Not accusation, hope. Nikolai exhaled slowly, the breath shaking. "Yes, comrade colonel. But I didn't just warm the engine. I changed what keeps it alive." Markov's jaw tightened. "Will it work again?" "It already has," Nikolai answered. "It can work on all of them." The colonel stared at him, then offered a single nod, one that carried both risk and faith. "You have permission." In that moment, Nikolai didn't feel triumphant. He felt terrified. Because now, failure meant more than humiliation. It meant men would die because they trusted him. No workshops, no blueprints, just freezing air, salvaged metal, and the stubborn refusal of men who refused to die. Stranded. Sparks flew as welders patched together crude manifolds from broken exhaust pipes. Mechanics hammered frozen bolts until knuckles bled. Engineers who once mocked Nikolai now hovered silently, watching, learning. "Where do you want the siphon line?" one asked, breath fogging. "Run it behind the track guards," Nikolai instructed, voice hoarse. "It keeps it shielded. If snow hits it, we lose pressure." A young crewman gripped Nikolai's arm. His voice cracked. "Just tell me it'll work, please. My brother is stuck at the forward trench." "If we don't move by morning," Nikolai didn't give speeches. He just squeezed the soldier's shoulder and returned to his tools. War didn't care about promises. Hours blurred into a fever of motion. Men worked barehanded, when gloves slowed them, skin freezing to steel only to be torn free when they moved too fast. They stuffed snow into wounds to numb the pain. One mechanic collapsed from cold. Another took his place without a word. Kerosene tanks were siphoned and secret fuel meant for lamps redirected to engines. Commanders paced in silence, knowing that if anyone reported this, they'd all face charges for sabotage or incompetence, but officers stayed quiet. Everyone was too close to breaking dot in the distance. German artillery pulsed like thunder behind the horizon, shells falling closer with each hour. A mortar blast shook the ground, peppering them with ice and dirt. Sparks scattered across armor. No one stopped working dot by midnight. 20 tanks had been modified dot by 2 a.m., 30 dot by 4 a.m. An entire battalion stood in formation hollow. Silent beasts waiting for breath, Nikolai stood at the front. Face streaked with soot, eyelashes crusted with frost. His hands trembled as he checked the final manifold clamp on the lead tank. Colonel Markov approached. Rifle slung over his shoulder. "If this works," he murmured, "we move before dawn. If it doesn't, we freeze," Nikolai finished. No more words were needed. A faint line of silver traced the horizon. Time was up. Nikolai lit the first match. It flared, then fluttered wildly in the wind. He cupped it with numb hands, touching it to the ignition wick. A low humph of heat burst into the manifold. Exhaust gas fed into the tube. Pressure circulated. The pipes trembled as warmth traveled through metal veins. The engine coughed. Men froze, not from cold, but from fear of hope. Another cough. A third, then a roar deep. Thunderous, alive, soldiers gasped, eyes wide. "One tank isn't enough," someone whispered. "We need all of them." Nikolai didn't wait. He hurried to the next, then the next, lighting each ignition as fast as frozen fingers allowed. Soon, the field erupted with a chorus of waking steel engines rumbling to life one after another. Exhaust plumes rising like black smoke signals across the horizon. Tank commanders climbed into turrets, stunned. We're moving. Not just moving. Marching. Tracks churned snow. Engines warmed faster than the wind could drain them. The entire battalion began to roll forward. 60 tanks, alive in temperatures that should have killed them. Across the valley, German panzers stood as silent statues, their crews desperately trying to force movement from metal frozen solid. Men beat engines with rifle butts. Officers screamed orders that nature refused to obey. A German mechanic lit a torch beneath a panzer hull only to recoil as fire-warped metal. They watched, helpless, as Soviet steel emerged through the blizzard, engines howling, treads crushing ice, turrets rotating with steady confidence. The battlefield turned. Inch by inch, under the weight of movement. Nikolai stood atop the lead tank, wind tearing through his coat, face numb, eyes burning with disbelief. All around him, men cheered not as victors, but as survivors who had defied nature itself. Colonel Markov climbed out of the turret beside him, staring across the frozen fields. "How did this happen?" he whispered. Nikolai didn't look at him. He stared at the Germans watching. Powerless as the unstoppable approached. "War didn't stop us," he said quietly. "Winter tried. And now..." For the first time, winter was losing. The tanks advanced into the storm. The first hint of dawn came not as light, but as a faint shimmer on the frozen horizon. Pale blues bleeding into ash-gray clouds. Wind whipped snow across the steppe like sheets of broken glass. From a distance, everything looked dead, silent, unmovable. Just another winter morning on the Eastern Front, except this time the silence was lying. Morozov stood atop the lead T-34. One gloved hand pressed against the newly rigged manifold beneath the engine deck, feeling for vibration through metal thick as a man's thigh. It was warm, truly warm, and the engine beneath it purred like a restless beast waiting to be unleashed. He exhaled, breath freezing instantly, and allowed himself a thin smile. "We did this. We actually did this." Around him, tank crews scrambled into their machines, slamming hatches, tightening scarves, whispering prayers. It was still surreal rows of armored steel humming with life while every other vehicle on the steppe, Soviet or German, lay frozen stiff like iron tombstones. Mechanics had stayed up all night batting sparks from welding torches, hammering plates into shape, threading improvised piping until their fingers bled through wool. Now, the battalion was alive. Colonel Sokolov approached, his fur coat rimed white with ice. His expression was grim, not from doubt, but from the weight of what was coming. "You'll ride in forward dawn with me," he said, referring to his command tank. "You earned that much." Morozov simply nodded. He had no speech prepared, no cinematic line to mark the moment. Just a wrench still strapped to his belt and oil stains frozen into his coat. In the enemy camp, figures moved sluggishly between tanks buried in frost. Diesel had thickened, engine blocks had cracked, batteries lay drained. Officers barked orders, but nothing roared to life except frustration. A German crewman slammed his fist against the frozen armor of a Panzer IV. "Verdammt! Sie bugen sich nicht. They won't move." Another soldier wiped frost from a vision slit just in time to witness something impossible. Over the wavering ice sheet, black silhouettes emerged, moving, one engine. Then three. Then an entire column. "Got," the German whispered, backing away. "Wie? How are they moving?" No one answered. No one could. Sokolov's voice crackled over comes. "All companies advance. Break them." Tracks churned ice into jagged shards. T-34s surged forward like predators freed from chains, steel hulls casting long shadows across the tundra. Machine gun fire rattled from nearby infantry units, who stared in disbelief as their armor finally moved faster than men on foot. Morozov braced himself inside the command tank as it lurched forward, the improvised heater system vibrating beneath his boots. He could hear the fuel mixture sloshing through metal veins, smell kerosene mingling with burning diesel, feel heat radiating like a heartbeat. This shouldn't have worked," he muttered. Sokolov grinned without looking at him. "And yet here we are." Frozen panzers became steel coffins, unable to rotate turrets or start engines. T-34s smashed through snowbanks, ramming disabled armor, firing point-blank into vehicles that could not even turn to face them. A German lieutenant waved signal flags desperately, screaming for artillery support. Shells struck nearby, but the Soviets were already moving again. A Panzer III crew attempted to fire its main gun, only to discover the breech jammed with ice. The commander stared helplessly as a T-34 thundered past at full speed, its crew yelling like men reborn. Nearby infantry threw grenades, but they bounced harmlessly off glistening armor, exploding in fountains of ice. It wasn't just a battle. It was a massacre, born from physics and desperation. Through the periscope glass, he saw the battlefield unfold like a fever dream, smoke rising from burning wrecks. Snow dyed black with diesel. Crews inside moving machines because he refused to freeze. Sokolov slammed a gloved hand on Morozov's shoulder. "Not many men live long enough to see their idea kill the enemy," he said. "Most innovations are just paperwork." Morozov didn't feel pride, only a heavy, solemn understanding. "If engines run," he replied quietly, "men die. I only made sure ours ran first." Outside, another German tank erupted into flames. Frozen equipment was abandoned in rows, like tombstones marking a defeated army. Soviet armor pressed forward relentlessly, their engines still warm. Still hungry, a junior Soviet tanker opened his hatch, snow whipping his face, and shouted across to another tank, "Morozov, whoever he has saved us all." Morozov heard it through the armor walls, though no one said his name directly. He closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him silently. He had not asked for recognition. He only wanted the engines to breathe again. As dusk returned and engines idled among conquered ground, Morozov climbed out, removed one glove, and pressed his bare hand against the tank's warm hull. Against the impossible cold. It felt like touching life itself. This battlefield isn't won by bullets, he thought. It's won by whoever refuses to freeze first. The war did not end with that single frozen dawn, nor did the Germans collapse overnight. Battles raged for years, cities rose and burned, borders shifted like restless ghosts. Eventually history would write long volumes about how winter defeated the Wehrmacht, how snow choked supply lines, how frost froze engines solid, how hungry soldiers dug graves in ice that refused to yield. Historians would point to weather as the decisive ally. Few would ever mention the man who taught engines how to survive it. Morozov never expected medals. He never asked for recognition. After the counterattack, he returned to his workshop of mud and steel, sleeves rolled to his elbows, working beside men who barely understood what they owed him. The improvised manifold became standard for dozens of tanks in the months that followed. Units whispered about a mysterious mechanic whose machines always started, even when others died in the cold. Some commanders sought him out directly, pleading with him to wake their tanks before offensives. He did the work without ceremony, sometimes patched with scrap tin, sometimes welding by moonlight, sometimes trading his own rations for a length of copper wire. The front didn't care about theory. It cared about movement. And movement meant life. By the next winter, design bureaus in Moscow and Sverdlovsk began rolling out official preheating systems, refined, standardized, safe. They weren't identical to his improvised design, but the principles flowed unmistakably from his battlefield experiments. War evolves fast, swallowing ideas faster than it produces heroes. The army issued new manuals. Engineers bragged about technical breakthroughs. Officers delivered confident briefings about strategic cold weather resilience. Morozov's name appeared nowhere. He kept a single piece of his first working manifold bent, burned, pockmarked by shrapnel. He slept with it beside his bedroll during retreats, carried it in a satchel during advances, and eventually stored it inside a wooden crate. When the war moved west and the land thawed, sometimes at night he would take it out, run his fingers across the metal, and feel the warmth that had once saved so many lives. Years later, at a veterans' gathering in a small Siberian town, a tanker recognized him by his scars and the burn mark on his right wrist. "You're Morozov," the man said, eyes widening as if seeing a ghost. "You're the reason we got home." Morozov smiled awkwardly, unsure what to say. Praise always felt heavier than steel plates. The veteran shook his hand with both of his, voice trembling. "Anyone can fire a gun," he said. "But you gave the gun legs." Morozov's throat tightened, and for a moment the memories rushed back, blowing snow, roaring engines, the shuddering shock of tanks bursting through enemy lines like thawing beasts. He nodded once, wordless, because words felt too small for what they carried. As time passed, official narratives reduced innovation to strategy and weather. The archives honored generals, marshals, and theorists. In footnotes, sometimes anonymous field modifications were mentioned but never traced. Morozov lived quietly, working at a tractor plant after the war, fixing engines that complained in different ways but carried familiar hearts. The world moved on. He married. He raised a daughter. He aged. Only in winter did memories return vividly when the wind howled like artillery and frost crept over glass. He would stop whatever he was doing, close his eyes, and imagine the rumbling sound of a tank engine that should have been silent. Machine refusing to die. A nation refusing to freeze. One night, sitting alone beside a snow-covered workshop, he whispered to no one, "Heroism isn't always pulling a trigger. Sometimes it's making sure the trigger can be pulled at all." Snow fell gently, soft as ash, settling on the cold earth where so many had once bled. The world slept peacefully, unaware that survival often hinged not on glory, but on quiet hands working in darkness. Sometimes history is saved not by warriors, but by welders. By stubborn minds. By sparks.